Why has the United States been so obsessed with trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela? There's not just one simple answer to that question. There are several factors. It is true that one of those factors is the fact that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
But the US is also the world's largest producer of oil. So there's no shortage of oil in the US. Now, yes, of course, many US companies want to get access to Venezuela's oil, and Venezuela's oil was nationalized by the leftist president, Hugo Chávez, who kicked out the US oil corporations.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We want everybody to know we're looking at all this very seriously. We don't want any American businesses or investors caught by surprise. They can see what President Trump did yesterday. We're following through on it. We're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
So that is certainly a factor in the US government backing numerous coup attempts trying to overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing government. But it's not just because of oil. There are other factors that are also very important that I'm going to be talking about today. Because the reality is that Venezuela, ever since the rise of the leftist president Hugo Chávez, who declared the Bolivarian revolution and turned Venezuela into a Bolivarian republic, ever since then, Venezuela has played a very important role in trying to build a multipolar world, challenging US hegemony, trying to form alliances not only with other countries in Latin America in a regional bloc to weaken their dependency on the US economy and the US dollar, but Venezuela has also deepened its friendship with other major powers like China, like Russia, like Iran. Venezuela has also helped to create new international organizations that try to unify Latin America, like, for instance, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, or the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America. For many years, Venezuela has also pushed for alternatives to the US dollar, and Venezuela has sold its oil in other currencies. And Venezuela has tried to develop an alternative to the US-led capitalist system, which also explains why, for instance, the US has imposed for more than 60 years a brutal blockade on Cuba, of course, a close ally of Venezuela, and Venezuela has been suffering under a similar blockade, very harsh sanctions imposed by the US, trying to suffocate the Venezuelan economy, just like it has tried to suffocate the Cuban economy for decades. So today I'm going to show a presentation that I delivered for a virtual conference on Venezuela and its July elections, talking about what's at stake in these elections, why the US government has been meddling in Venezuela's internal affairs, trying to overthrow the Bolivarian government, first trying to overthrow President Hugo Chávez, and ever since trying to overthrow President Nicolás Maduro, and why the US has been backing right-wing opposition forces that not only want to privatize Venezuela's oil and allow US oil companies to profit, but furthermore, the US-backed opposition wants to break Venezuela's friendship with China, with Russia, with Iran, with the BRICS bloc, and they want to subordinate Venezuela and Latin America as a whole to the United States. We've seen this happen numerous times in Latin America. When there is a US-backed coup and a right-wing government comes to power, they withdraw from all of the other regional organizations like CELAC and ALBA. They withdraw from BRICS, like is what happened in Argentina under the far-right leader Javier Milei, who rejected the invitation to join BRICS. So today I'm going to talk about the geopolitics of Venezuela and how the Bolivarian Revolution has played a very key role in building a multipolar world. So without further ado, this is the presentation that I delivered at a virtual conference organized by the independent news website Orinoco Tribune and also by the International Manifesto Group. Today I'll be discussing Venezuela's very important role in helping to build a multipolar world. This is very important because this is a term that we've heard more and more in the past few years. Even recently, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, Josep Borrell, has acknowledged that Western dominance is over, and he has acknowledged that we're in an increasingly multipolar world. You'll see mainstream corporate media outlets like The Economist, the Financial Times acknowledge that we're in a multipolar world. But Venezuela has played a very important role in this. When we talk about multipolarity, it's not simply the rise of China, the reemergence of Russia, other, powers like Iran, Brazil, India, but also Venezuela has played a very significant role. And the Bolivarian Revolution has been very significant in this process. And Hugo Chávez himself was extremely prescient. And in 1998, when Chávez was still campaigning for the presidential election, he gave a speech in the Palacio de las Academias on the 12th of August, and he famously said, quote, "The world of the 21st century that already appears on the horizon will not be bipolar nor unipolar, thank God. It will be multipolar." Now, I really want to emphasize how prescient and incredible this was. In 1998, this is the peak of US unipolarity with the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, then the Gulf War leading up to the invasion of Iraq, the US government's declaration of full spectrum dominance, the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And a year before Chávez made this speech, Brzezinski published his famous book, The Grand Chessboard, in which he talked about the strategy by which the US would try to maintain this unipolar order to prevent the emergence of any powers that could challenge US hegemony. So the fact that Chávez could see this so early is a testament to how brilliant he was in his vision, not only for Venezuela, not only for Latin America as a regional bloc, but for the world. Now that quote is well known. What is not as well known is the larger context. So in this speech that we have a transcript of, I posted the link, the source here, I translated the larger context of the quote. He continues saying in this quote that there is obviously a North American pole. He noted that there was a European pole that had emerged with the European Union. At this time, many people still thought that Europe might be a more independent pole, although, of course, we've seen that in the past 20 years, the EU has been completely subordinated to the United States, which has only gotten worse with the proxy war in Ukraine. Chávez acknowledged an Asian pole. He also said, very importantly, China is rising. And he could see this very clearly. This is before China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 and saw incredible world historic double-digit GDP growth. But still, he could see very clearly that China was rising. He talked about the Asian tigers, which had gone through the 1997 Asian financial crisis, but he noted that they still made effort to lift themselves up. But what's very important is Chávez also said, look, Latin America must be an important pole in this multipolar world. With great effort, he said, we have an obligation as well as the need to propel the formation in the medium term of a true world power in this part of the world, in this part of the American continent. And he noted that Venezuela could be a hinge, not only in South America, but linking Central America to South America, linking the Caribbean to Latin America. And of course, the fact that he could see the rise of China in the 1990s is very important. Of course, this is probably the most important geopolitical development of the 21st century is the economic rise of China, overtaking the United States as the world's largest economy, according to IMF data in 2017. Today, China, when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, represents 19% of world GDP. And that's actually probably an understatement because of the way China measures GDP. It actually emphasizes manufacturing production and downplays services, whereas a huge part of US GDP is fictitious capital in the financial sector. The US also does computed GDP using, for instance, owner-occupied housing. So what you would charge if you were renting your house, and that's computed into GDP. So the point is if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that China has become the world's largest manufacturing power by far, representing 35% of global gross production in manufacturing. So the fact that Chávez could see this, I mean, again, is a testament to how much of a visionary he was. And Chávez took his first trip to China in 1999, his first year of his presidency. And this was also important because it marked the 50th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. It also marked the 25th anniversary of Venezuela's relations with China. And this year, 2024, they just celebrated their 50th anniversary and had an event that I attended in Beijing. Furthermore, in a speech that Chávez gave when he visited Peking University in 1999, he said, quote, "We have begun to produce an autonomous world politics independent of any center of power. And in that, we are also like China." So emphasizing this increasing multipolarity back in the 1990s. Now, Chávez visited China more than any other leader in Latin America and the Caribbean, and multiple times throughout his terms. And in 2001, he met with Jiang Zemin, and they declared a strategic partnership for common development. And that has very much continued and strengthened under President Nicolás Maduro. And in 2023, Maduro visited China and signed 31 comprehensive agreements, including they formally upgraded their relations to what China refers to as an all-weather strategic partnership, which is one of the highest designations at the level of Pakistan. Very important for China-Venezuela relations. Now, if this is a chart that looks at the number of agreements signed between China and Venezuela as of 2017, so this could very much be updated with scores of more, well over 500. But as between 1974 and 1998, before the Bolivarian Revolution, before Chávez and Maduro, Venezuela and China only had signed 20 agreements. From 1999 to 2017, in just 18 years, they signed 472 agreements. This really emphasizes how important this friendship is. And this is a chart that shows trade between Venezuela and China, which is so important because, as I'll be talking about with sanctions, China, being the world's largest economy, has been an economic lifeline that has allowed Venezuela to pursue an alternative path, trying to build socialism, challenging neoliberalism and US-led imperialism. And if you look in the 1990s, trade was basically zero. In the 2000s, there was trade, but it was pretty negligible. And it started increasing in the late 2000s and exploded in the 2010s, especially under President Maduro. And what's interesting about this chart is you can see that actually Venezuela has enjoyed a trade surplus with China. Of course, most of that is oil exports, but that's still important because, of course, China has a massive current account surplus and it has a massive trade surplus with many countries. But with Venezuela and also with Brazil, it actually has a trade deficit. And this is extremely important because the US has tried to crush Venezuela through sanctions and a blockade. And this chart on the left, you can see that Venezuela's oil production, it's not a coincidence, it collapsed, first of all, when the US pressured Saudi Arabia in the 2010s to collapse international oil prices. This is before Saudi Arabia was pursuing a more independent, non-aligned policy. And John Kerry took a trip to Riyadh and made an agreement in which the US provided more and more support to the extremist far-right forces, the Contras in Syria, in an attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. And in return, Saudi Arabia massively overproduced oil, which collapsed the price of oil in the international market, which also was an attempt to crush not only Venezuela, but also Iran, to try to pressure Iran to go to the negotiating table of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And of course, it was an attempt to punish Russia after the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, which had historically been part of Russia and was only given as basically a formality when Ukraine and Russia were part of the Soviet Union. And the US was trying to suffocate Russia's economy with the imposition of sanctions, and then furthermore, with the collapse of oil prices. Following that, the Obama administration declared Venezuela to be a so-called extraordinary and unusual threat to the national security of the United States. And that led to capital flight. It led to international investors refusing to invest in Venezuela because of fear of US sanctions, which followed many rounds of aggressive sanctions that started under Obama and accelerated under Trump and have continued under Biden. And you can see it's not a coincidence that oil production in Venezuela collapsed. And in fact, the US Energy Information Administration boasts of this on its website, noting that Venezuelan oil production fell to its lowest levels in 2019 at the peak of the US-led coup attempt, the lowest levels since 2003 when the US orchestrated the coup that briefly succeeded just 2 days in Venezuela in April 2002. And then there was an oil lockout, a boss's fake strike led by pro-imperialist elements in PDVSA, the oil company. So Venezuela is in some ways part of this global trend. This map should be updated. This map shows how China has become the largest trading partner of a plurality of countries on Earth. Actually, it recently became a majority of countries on Earth. And Venezuela has also, its largest trading partner is now China. This should be updated. But the point is that Venezuela has been part of a global trend, but it has been at the vanguard of this trend. Along with Latin America as a whole, you can see that in the early 2000s, trade with China was still very, very low, but it has absolutely exploded to such an extent that now China is the largest trading partner of Latin America as a whole, if you exclude Mexico. Now, of course, here I've been speaking a lot about Venezuela's partnership with China, which is very important, but it's not just that. Under Hugo Chávez, Venezuela deepened its relationship with Russia and also with Iran. And under President Maduro, Venezuela has continued strengthening its friendship with these countries. This is, of course, very important. The US sees Russia and Iran as some of its main strategic adversaries. And in fact, when a US Army general, Christopher Cavoli, was testifying for the Senate Armed Services Committee, he referred to China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK, that is North Korea, as a so-called axis of adversaries. So the fact that Venezuela has been forming a close partnership with these countries is another reason why the US has been so desperate to try to destabilize Venezuela, to overthrow its independent government. But the reason that I focus so much on Venezuela's partnership with China in particular is because China is by far the most powerful country that's an alternative to US-led imperialism. China has become the world's largest economy. And if you listen to the speeches given by US officials, they constantly say that China is the biggest so-called long-term threat, because although Russia is a significant power militarily and politically, and it is a significant economy, China is the world's largest economy. It has 1.4 billion people. It has an even larger military, and China continues to grow and develop very rapidly. And that's why US officials are so afraid of China. And they say, for instance, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that China is the only country that can actually create a global alternative to US-led dominance, to the so-called rules-based international order in which the US makes the rules and orders everyone around. So this is why Venezuela's partnership with China is so important, because every time there's been a revolution in Latin America or in the global South, but especially in Latin America, in Cuba in 1959, in Nicaragua in 1979, and then following under Hugo Chávez in 1999 in Venezuela, every single time one of these governments comes to power, the US tries to overthrow them with coups, like the CIA overthrew the elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953, or the CIA overthrew the elected left-wing leader of Guatemala in 1954. And there are dozens and dozens of other examples like Sukarno in Indonesia and Nkrumah in Ghana and so many other examples. Every time one of these progressive, independent, anti-imperialist leaders comes to power, they're targeted by the US with not only a coup, but also sanctions. Cuba has been under illegal US sanctions and illegal US blockade ever since 1960, 61, 62. And the US has tried to suffocate the Cuban economy to overthrow the Cuban government. The same thing that it has done in Venezuela. A US State Department cable from 1960 admitted that the goal of the US sanctions on Cuba was to weaken the economic life of Cuba. That's a quote. To, quote, make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That's the goal of the US blockade on Cuba. That's the goal of the US blockade on Venezuela. That's the goal of the US sanctions on Nicaragua, on Iran, on Syria, on Zimbabwe, on the DPRK, on Russia, and on China. But of course, the difference is that Venezuela, Syria, Zimbabwe, the DPRK are relatively small countries. China is one of the world's biggest countries with 1.4 billion people. It has the world's largest economy. So yes, Russia is a significant power, and Russia has provided support to Venezuela and Cuba and other independent countries. But China actually has the power to fundamentally transform the global economy so that US sanctions no longer can destroy economies. So that essentially US sanctions, maybe they're not insignificant. They still are felt by the countries suffering under them, but they're no longer the kind of death sentence that they have been for decades. So this is why it's so important to look at Venezuela's partnership with China and to see how important it has been and how Venezuela has really punched above its weight in geopolitics and shown that it's possible for a country in Latin America to challenge US imperialism and neocolonialism, the idea, this arrogant neocolonialist idea that Latin America is the so-called backyard of the US. And instead, Venezuela has helped to forge a new multipolar path in the world by deepening these partnerships, not only politically, but also economically, challenging US-led imperialism and challenging the dollar system and trying to build alternatives with new organizations like BRICS. Now, President Maduro has applied officially for Venezuela to join BRICS, and Maduro said that BRICS represents the potential, quote, new world order without hegemony, without empires, without colonialism of free and independent countries. And BRICS, of course, although there are internal contradictions, it represents an economic alternative to US-led imperialism. And the BRICS economy is largely because of China, but also to a lesser extent because of India and Russia, which have seen very large economic growth in recent years. The BRICS countries have overtaken the G7 as the largest economic bloc when their GDP is measured at purchasing power parity. And again, if you look at GDP, you're not talking about what kind of economic production is happening in the economy, goods and services. If you also look at things like production of major commodities, if you look at wheat, oil, gas, iron ore, and manufacturing production capabilities, BRICS is certainly significantly more important than the G7. Another way in which Venezuela, and in particular Chávez, but also Maduro, have been extremely prescient is in not only discussions of de-dollarization, but attempts to try to create tangible alternatives to the US dollar system. And as far back as 2007, and actually even before, Chávez had talked about the importance of challenging the dollar. But in 2007, he made the concrete proposal for the creation of the sucre. And this actually happened in 2009 with the creation of the Sucre, the unified system for regional compensation. And that was created in 2009. And from 2010 into 2016, it was used for over $1 billion worth of trade. And it was mostly with Ecuador. And then with the basically internal coup after Rafael Correa left power in 2017, and you had the rise of Lenin Moreno, who basically, he was a traitor who did a kind of internal coup. And then you subsequently had right-wing pro-imperialist governments that led to the death of the Sucre. But this is very important because today we've seen, for instance, Lula da Silva in Brazil has really talked once again about the importance of challenging US dollar hegemony. He's called for creating a Latin American currency. And of course, Brazil is the B in BRICS. He took a trip to China in 2023 and went to the New Development Bank, which is currently headed by former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, and talked about the importance of creating alternatives to the dollar. This is, of course, very important and very welcome, but this is well over a decade after Venezuela played a lead role in actually creating a Latin American currency. And because of the series of coups in the region, the rise of right-wing governments, that we did see the unfortunate death of the Sucre in the short term. But I do think that in the long term, the medium to the long term, Chávez and Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution will be shown to be extremely visionary. Now, of course, the institution that helped to oversee the creation of the Sucre was the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our Americas. And as is often forgotten, it's not just the ALBA, but also the TCP, which stands for the People's Trade Treaty. So the idea is to create an alternative to neoliberal free trade fundamentalism, which in reality is not free trade, it's freedom for foreign investors. The vast majority of so-called free trade agreements, they're not so concerned about free trade, they're concerned about making sure that foreign capital concentrated in the US on Wall Street, in City of London, that they have so-called freedom of investment with no capital control, so they can move very speculative capital flows and hot money in and out of the country without any limitations. But the ALBA TCP has always been an alternative for what a regional trade bloc could look like. And of course, this is why the US has targeted the ALBA and has pressured every government in the region to withdraw from and sabotage ALBA. And the photo on the left showing ALBA in the first iteration back when Chávez was still in power before his death in 2013, you can see that almost all of the leaders in this photo were targeted by US coups. So in the case of, on the right of the photo, you can see Manuel Zelaya, the elected president of Honduras, who was overthrown in a US-backed right-wing military coup in 2009. You can see to the right of him, to our left, is Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, who was overthrown in a US-backed coup in 2019. You can see, of course, Chávez, who was a victim of a US-backed coup in 2002, and many constant, never-ending coup attempts subsequently. And then, of course, you have Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista leader, the president of Nicaragua, and he was targeted in a very violent coup attempt that failed in 2018. And of course, there was the Contra death squads in the 1980s. So it's not a coincidence that the US has targeted all of these leaders for overthrow. And after Rafael Correa left power in Ecuador in 2017, the internal coup happened and Ecuador withdrew from the ALBA. And after the 2009 coup against Zelaya and Honduras, the right-wing coup regime also withdrew from ALBA. And after the US-backed coup against Evo in Bolivia in 2019, Bolivia also withdrew from ALBA. We can see a very clear trend here. So the US has seen this, US-led imperialism has seen the ALBA as one of the most significant threats to imperialism in the region and to US economic hegemony. And then, of course, we all know, I don't need to speak about, I mentioned the 2002 coup that was backed by the George Bush administration. And then, of course, in 2019, the coup attempt with Juan Guaido that the US government played a key role in. We all know about this. There has been a lot of attention to Venezuela's oil, and it certainly is true. I'm not saying this is not a factor. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, And Trump himself said in a Republican Party rally in 2023, when I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil, would have been right next door. This quote got some attention, especially the oil element. But in reality, I think actually what he said is even crazier than we're going to take Venezuela's oil. He said, we would have taken over Venezuela. He didn't say we'll take over the oil. He said we would have taken over the country. And this, of course, has continued under the Democrats, under Biden. It started under Obama. This is very much bipartisan. And there has been attention to comments made by, for instance, Laura Richardson, the commander of U.S. Southern Command under Biden. She said in 2023, she talked about all of the lithium and the lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, the world's largest oil reserves, not only in Venezuela, but also Guyana, which is increasingly becoming a kind of U.S. protectorate. The U.S. is using Guyana to try to destabilize Venezuela. There are reports that it's going to build a military base in Guyana. They're attempting to seize Venezuelan territory. She mentioned Venezuela's resources, oil, copper, gold. She mentioned that China imports a lot of food from the region, the Amazon, of course, fresh water, which with climate change is becoming more and more important. But I think it's very simplistic to say simply that the U.S. is desperate to overthrow Venezuela's government because of oil, because of resources. It is a factor. I'm not disputing that. John Bolton, the national security advisor under Trump, acknowledged that U.S. oil companies wanted to get access to Venezuelan oil after Chávez had kicked them out and nationalized the oil industry. It's certainly a factor. But of course, the U.S. is also the world's largest oil producer. The U.S. doesn't need Venezuela's oil. U.S. companies would like it. The U.S. would like to get access to other resources in Venezuela. But in reality, I think, the main driving factor is fundamentally, it is political. Of course, economics and politics are inextricably tied. There's no difference between them. But in the sense that Venezuela has been, as I've been talking about here for this presentation, it has been at the vanguard of challenging U.S.-led imperialism and creating a new multipolar order. And John Bolton himself acknowledged this. Of course, he was Trump's national security advisor. He was the architect of the coup attempt in 2019, which he boasted about in an interview on CNN. And in his memoir, Bolton said that Venezuela is a direct challenge to the colonialist Monroe Doctrine. And he said that we must resurrect the Monroe Doctrine. I put the term return in scare quotes because in reality, the Monroe Doctrine never really went away. It never went away, but in particular, we can see that in the past few years, multiple U.S. government officials have invoked the Monroe Doctrine. And in his memoir, Bolton in particular spoke of Venezuela as a threat to the Monroe Doctrine, in particular because of its relations with Russia, China, and Iran. So I really think it's very important to emphasize not only how much of a visionary Hugo Chávez was, but also how President Maduro has continued Venezuela's multipolar construction and has not only maintained an independent foreign policy, but an activist foreign policy in trying to build a multipolar world that is not simply a dictatorship of US-led imperialism, because that's really, the unipolar era was an international dictatorship led by US imperialism. And the US talks about so-called democracy as if it were a democracy, which it very much is not. But in reality, you cannot talk about democracy when a small handful of imperialist countries that were the colonizing powers that colonized the majority of the world, their goal is to control the entire world, the entire political system, and the entire economy. That is an international dictatorship. And in that sense, Venezuela has been at the vanguard of trying to build an actual international democracy, which we can call multipolarity, from the beginning, before Chávez even came to power. We can see in 1998, through his terms into 2013, Maduro has very much continued with this. And the Bolivarian revolution, I think, represents one of the most important revolutions in modern history, in that it showed that even a relatively small country compared to big powers like China and Russia, even a relatively smaller country like Venezuela, can be at the vanguard of helping to build a true international democratic order. On that note, I'm going to conclude. Thanks a lot for having me today.